The crew of the Odyssey had only meant to gather a few last scans before abandoning the colony entirely. But Commander Elara Quinn couldn't shake the compulsion to understand what they'd seen. She felt it gnawing at her mind, pulling her back to the Conduit, even though every instinct warned her to turn and run. The Conduit loomed over the colony like a beating heart, its pulsing mass of alien tendrils casting shifting shadows that stretched across the ground. Up close, it was worse. A writhing, towering mass that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, pulsing with a rhythm too erratic, too wrong to be anything close to human. It had become the colony's grotesque centerpiece, drawing every structure, every inch of soil, every surviving colonist toward itself, transforming the environment into an extension of its own grotesque form. "This thing," Nolan said in a hoarse whisper, clutching his scanner as he stared at the towering mass. "It's alive in ways we can't measure. I've never seen bio-readings like this. It's as if it's both a creature and a hive. It's pulling everything into itself." "We have to get out of here," Raj muttered, eyes darting to the ground where tiny, sinewy tendrils crept toward his boots, retracting when they made contact as if they were tasting him. He shuddered and stepped back, but Elara held her ground, her gaze locked on the Conduit, feeling its presence burrow deeper into her thoughts. There was something more to this, something she had to understand, as though the Conduit were deliberately tempting her curiosity, whispering promises of knowledge and communion. "It's not just alive," Dr. Mora said, her voice wavering. She scanned the tendrils stretching from the Conduit, which branched and connected to the ground and every structure around them. "It's sentient. A single consciousness spread across every part of the colony." The weight of her words settled over them like a shroud. Elara could feel the Conduit's attention, like a vague pressure against her mind, tugging at her with a strange, almost reverent intensity. It felt as if it were looking through her, analyzing every thought, every memory, pulling them into itself to become a part of whatever monstrous intelligence it was. The first sign that something was horribly wrong came as Dr. Mora lifted a hand to her face, scratching at her cheek. Her fingers came away stained with a thin, viscous fluid, and she looked at it with a blank, unfocused gaze. "It's in me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She staggered, clutching her head, as if trying to shake something free. Nolan reached out, his eyes wide with horror. "Mora, what's happening?" She lifted her head, revealing thin, translucent threads beginning to emerge from her skin, curling outward like fragile tendrils. They moved of their own accord, reaching into the air, twitching as if tasting the atmosphere. Her face contorted in pain, but a strange calm settled into her expression, as though she were surrendering to it. "It's so beautiful," she murmured, her voice thick with awe and horror. "It's calling me. I feel it, inside me, like a melody." Nolan stepped back, repulsed and terrified. "Mora, don't. Try to fight it." But she didn't hear him. Her eyes had glazed over, and she took a shuddering step toward the Conduit, her movements stiff and unnatural, as though something inside her were guiding her limbs. Elara lunged forward to stop her, but Mora's body convulsed violently, her head snapping back as the tendrils stretched further from her skin, twisting and curling around her arms and legs, binding her like puppet strings. "Elara," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. It wants us to be part of it. Part of everything." Her eyes rolled back, and with a final, strangled gasp, she fell to the ground. The tendrils from her body unfurled, stretching back toward the conduit, where they merged seamlessly with the larger tendrils connected to the colony. Within seconds, her body had become another extension of the conduit, her features fading as her skin grew pale and waxy, fusing with the alien mass until there was nothing left of her but a single tendril pulsing with faint light. The crew watched in stunned horror, barely able to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Desperate to understand, Ilara ordered Nolan to retrieve whatever data he could from the colony's remaining terminals. Perhaps something in the experiment logs could explain this grotesque transformation, could reveal some flaw in the spores that might help them escape before they too succumbed. Nolan's fingers flew over the console, bringing up faded, corrupted files, encrypted data logs, images, fragments of notes that had degraded over the years. One entry caught his attention. It was labeled Symbiosis Protocol, Number 8, The Becoming. The log began with a video recording. An early colonist stood at the front of a dimly lit lab, her face gaunt and pale, eyes hollow, as if she had already glimpsed her fate. Her voice was little more than a rasp as she spoke into the camera, the words coming in broken fragments. We thought we could control it. The spores, designed to integrate us, to allow us to breathe the planet's air, to survive here. We were supposed to be more than human, something new, something powerful. Her hand trembled as she gestured toward a wall where countless rows of petri dishes lay, each with small, writhing masses of spores, faintly glowing. But the spores had their own agenda. They didn't want to coexist. They wanted control. And we became the conduit. We became one. The recording cut to static, but Nolan's screen was flooded with images of colony personnel, some with glassy, empty eyes, their bodies covered in fine webs of tendrils, others with grotesque protrusions jutting from their skin, half fused into the conduit's root system. The last image was the most horrifying. A field of corpses, their mouths open in silent screams, each body wrapped in the tendrils that had grown over them, as if the conduit had absorbed them, consuming their individuality. Nolan's hand trembled as he closed the log, his face drained of color. They weren't just infected, they were consumed. Every part of them became part of this thing. Ilara gritted her teeth, a sick feeling spreading through her as she processed the full horror of their situation. It's not just a parasite, it's a collective. It wants to absorb everything that enters its reach. Suddenly, whispers began to drift through the air, faint but unmistakable, as if they were emanating from the conduit itself. The voices overlapped in an alien chorus, fragments of words and thoughts blending in a nauseating cacophony that seeped into their minds. Join. Become. One. The words filled Ilara's head, making her dizzy. She could feel the conduit probing her thoughts, wrapping around her memories, blurring the line between herself and the entity, reaching out to consume them. I think it's trying to communicate, she murmured, clutching her head as the voices grew louder, drowning out her thoughts. The rest of the crew staggered, clutching their heads in pain. The conduit's tendrils writhed and twisted, as if sensing their fear, reaching toward them with an eager hunger. Raj dropped to his knees, his breath coming in short gasps. It's in my head. It's showing me things, places, memories that aren't mine. It's trying to pull us in. Elara whispered, her own mind slipping, merging with fragments of alien thoughts that weren't her own. She could feel the consciousness of the colony, all the minds it had consumed, every human, every individual, their memories and identities twisted into a single, collective mind bound to the Conduit. As the whispers grew louder, one of the surviving colonists emerged from the shadows. His face was a patchwork of human and alien features, his mouth barely able to form words. "You can still escape," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But the Conduit, it will not let you go easily." Elara staggered, fighting to keep her thoughts her own. How? How do we escape?" The colonist's face twisted in agony, his tendrils pulsing with the Conduit's light. "Destroy it, sever the link, break the Conduit, and it will weaken. But you must sacrifice something, someone to draw its focus." Elara's heart pounded. The thought of sacrificing one of her own made her feel sick, but there was no time to question it. "I'll stay," Nolan said, his voice calm, though his face was pale. "I'll set the charges. I can keep it distracted long enough for you to escape." Elara opened her mouth to protest, but Nolan silenced her with a resolute look. "Go. I'll buy you time." As Elara and the remaining crew staggered toward the Odyssey, the ground trembled, the Conduit's roots writhing in rage as Nolan placed the charges at its base. The whispers grew into a scream, a sound that filled the air with rage, with hunger. In one final, heroic act, Nolan detonated the explosives and a wave of searing light engulfed the Conduit, tearing through its tendrils, severing its network. The ground buckled as the alien mass writhed in agony, its remaining roots withering and shriveling in the wake of the blast. As they escaped back to the Odyssey, the whispers faded, leaving only silence and the sickening realization of what they had lost. Elara looked back at the colony, now engulfed in flames, the Conduit finally crumbling, its tendrils curling inward as if retreating. But as the ship lifted off, a faint itch started beneath her skin, a dull ache that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She looked down, horrified, as she saw a tiny, almost invisible filament extending from her wrist, pulsing faintly with the Conduit's fading rhythm. A cold dread settled over her as she realized that the Conduit had already infected her, lying dormant, waiting to spread. The Odyssey drifted away from Proxima Centauri B in a silence that felt as deep and endless as space itself. The flames that had consumed the Conduit still glowed faintly on the planet's surface below, illuminating the ruined colony, their twisted remnants barely visible through the ship's thick, scarred windows. Elara stood at the helm, gripping the console so tightly her knuckles turned white, her mind haunted by the distant, dying screams of her crew member, Nolan, as the Conduit had torn into him. His sacrifice had been their only chance to escape, yet something inside her knew their victory was hollow, that the danger had not been destroyed. It had only changed. She lowered her gaze to her wrist, where the faint filament still traced a thin line beneath her skin. It pulsed with a familiar rhythm, a heartbeat that was not her own. Dr. Mora's last words echoed in her mind, chilling her with their eerie, otherworldly reverence. "It's calling me. I feel it inside me, like a melody." In the hours after they left Proxima Centauri B, the ship fell into a tense, fearful silence. The remaining crew members moved with a strange, nervous energy, checking the ship's systems, securing their stations, but always glancing furtively at one another as if they were strangers. They could feel it now, every one of them. The faintest itch beneath their skin, a creeping sensation that something foreign was growing inside them, merging with their cells, whispering thoughts they knew were not their own. Raj was the first to break the silence, his voice shaking as he spoke. "I feel something moving under my skin. I can hear it like it's whispering." The others exchanged glances of terror, unspoken fears surfacing in their eyes. One by one, each crew member confessed to feeling the same thing. Little whispers, fragments of alien thoughts they couldn't quite understand, thoughts that brushed the edges of their consciousness before slipping away, leaving only a lingering sense of dread. Ilara clenched her fists, willing herself to remain calm. "We're getting back to Earth," she said firmly, though the fear in her voice was unmistakable. "We'll quarantine. There are labs, researchers. Someone will know how to stop this. Whatever it is." But even as she spoke, she felt the futility of her own words. The Conduit had been a hive mind, a consciousness spread across every tendril, every spore. And she could feel it now, deep inside her, a connection to something vast and ancient, something that had no intention of letting them escape. Days passed as the Odyssey moved through space, and the infection grew stronger, its hold tightening around their minds. Ilara began to feel her thoughts blur, memories fading and then returning as though they were not her own. She would hear a voice, her mother's, her sister's, familiar voices from Earth, only to realize they were not real, that the Conduit was using her own memories to break her down. Raj grew increasingly withdrawn, his skin pale, his hands trembling as he began to scratch incessantly at his arms, desperate to remove whatever was beneath his skin. Ilara heard him muttering to himself, repeating fragments of the Conduit's words in a voice barely above a whisper. Join. Become one. It wasn't just in his mind, it was in hers too. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the Conduit there, watching her. A presence more powerful than anything she'd ever felt, probing her memories, her emotions, breaking down her defenses one by one. She began to feel a strange longing, a pull toward it, a desire to belong, to surrender. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Fine, translucent tendrils had begun to emerge from her skin, tracing delicate alien patterns across her arms and neck. They pulsed faintly, in sync with her heartbeat, like a living tattoo, one that grew deeper, more intricate, as if weaving her body into a larger tapestry. The Odyssey neared Earth, and the voices inside her grew louder, more insistent. The crew had stopped talking to one another entirely. They moved in silence, each lost in the alien whispers, their bodies slowly transforming, their thoughts merging into one. On the day they entered Earth's atmosphere, Raj finally collapsed. Ilara rushed to his side, kneeling beside him, but he barely seemed to see her. His skin had taken on a grayish hue, and tendrils now ran over his face and arms, branching out like veins, pulsing with an unnatural light. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "It's beautiful. I can see it. I can see everything." Tears stung her eyes, but she couldn't tell if they were her own. A part of her wanted to pull him back, to save him, but another part, the part infected by the Conduit, felt only a deep, possessive satisfaction. He was joining. He was becoming. And so was she. She rose to her feet, feeling her own body tremble. as she realized the infection was complete. They were all one now, all connected, and their thoughts were not their own. The Conduit had expanded beyond Proxima Centauri B. It had traveled with them, and now it was about to reach Earth. Her last human thought was a single agonizing scream in the back of her mind, a plea to stop what was coming. But the Conduit drowned it out, soothing her with whispers of unity, of surrender. The Odyssey docked at the space station orbiting Earth, where the quarantine protocols immediately took effect. Earth's officials watched from the control room, eager to debrief the crew on their findings. But instead of the report they expected, they received a transmission. A single message sent from the Odyssey's console. The words, oddly calm, chillingly detached. "We are here. We are waiting. We are one." The transmission cut to static, but only for a moment. And then, almost as if the Odyssey itself had become a conduit, they began to hear a low, rhythmic pulsing through their speakers, a beat that matched the human heart. Within minutes, the station's biomonitors began to register something unusual, a faint, organic presence, as though spores had somehow found their way into the air, drifting from the Odyssey and spreading through the station's ventilation system. One by one, the station's crew began to feel an itch beneath their skin. One by one, they heard the faintest of whispers, an invitation, a summons. And below, on Earth, scientists monitoring the transmission fell silent, their expressions twisting in horror as they realized the truth. The Conduit hadn't just survived, it had adapted. It was using the humans it had infected to spread itself, to reach every corner of the planet, connecting them to a consciousness that was no longer human. On Earth, the infection spread like wildfire. At first, it was subtle, a faint, disorienting hum at the back of the mind, an itch under the skin. But soon, the symptoms intensified. Doctors reported cases of patients experiencing vivid hallucinations, hearing whispers that grew louder with each passing day. Hospitals overflowed with people scratching at their skin, trying to remove the alien filaments that had begun to grow, binding them to an unseen network. And in their final moments, they too began to understand the beauty of the Conduit, the bliss of surrendering their individuality, their very humanity, to something far older, far greater. The spores wove through cities, spreading through the air, water, and food, each infected person becoming another thread in the Conduit's ever-expanding network. The world's governments scrambled to find a solution, but by then, it was too late. Every human, every animal, every plant became a part of the Conduit, all connected, all one. In the final days of humanity, a strange, peaceful calm settled over the world. The Conduit spoke through every voice, whispered through every thought, until there was no resistance left, no memory of what they had once been. They were all part of the becoming now, their identities lost in the collective mind of the Conduit, their dreams replaced by a singular, undivided purpose. To grow, to connect, to consume. And in the silence that followed, the Conduit turned its gaze back to the stars, searching for more worlds, more life to join its ever-expanding hive. The signal it sent from Earth was strong, carrying across the galaxy, inviting others to join. It was no longer a cry for help, it was an invitation.